A lot of thoughts on this, so strap in.
Seatbelt buckled. Welcome to the Film Riot Podcast. I'm Ryan Conley, and today on the show we have my friend Frank Barbiere. He is a comic book writer. He is a writer in general, but mostly known for his comic books, including one of my favorites, Five Ghosts. He started in film school and screenplays, and then made his transition into comic books after that. So I thought it would be great to pick his brain about stories in general, the differences between writing for the different two mediums, structure, and so on. And we're going to get into all of that. So I'm going to shut up right now and get into it with Frank. So you started in the industry with comic books, is that right?
Yes. It was an interesting transition. As I was in college, I took a screenwriting class and for the first time learned story structure and got immediately like, I'm 20 years old, I'm going to write a screenplay and get rich. That did not happen, but learning...
Really? It happens for everybody, though.
Startlingly, yeah. I did it was actually the year of the writer strike. Was in close proximity after the first time I took screenwriting, which probably makes me sound like I'm 13 years old. But but I remember because I was trying to cold call places because I immediately wrote a very bad script that I thought was clearly a movie that deserved to be made.
Right.
And I remember cold calling a few places and it just being just such a bad environment because everyone was going on strike and blah, blah, blah. But through that, I kind of got my act together and learned what structured writing was, and then discovered a bunch of these comics I read from Image are actually just creator owned submission driven comics. People make them and then submit them. So I immediately started just finding artists online and creating comic pitches, and from there it still took 4 years, but eventually did a small graphic novel that no one should ever read because it was very bad, but basically taught me how comics really work and how to use format and a bunch of production stuff. And from there, just kind of kept going at it. And so through an artist contact I had, we blind submitted to Dark Horse and got the opportunity to publish some short stories in an anthology magazine they have called Dark Horse Presents that had just relaunched. That was one of the first, I'm not a total hack, this is happening. But then I had been working with Chris Mooneyham, who I met all through DeviantArt and such. But he happened to live in New Jersey, where I was from and where I was teaching at the time. So we actually became friends because he was a Kubert school student. And we just developed a bunch of pitches. I kept working, and eventually one of those was Five Ghosts. And that one ended up going through and getting picked up at Image. And that's a long, long way to say, yes, comics is where I started. But really, I consider Five Ghosts getting published, which was just a little over 6 years ago, I want to say now. The first big thing I did that led me down to a full-time career in writing and in a full-time career in comics for a while as well. So that was the start of it.
And that took you 4 years to get to that point from when you started, writing things, trying to get the comic books made. It was 4 years after that before Five Ghosts?
Yes, which maybe, I'm trying to think, possibly a little longer, maybe more 5, because I was in college at the time. And the reason I remember is because I was idiotically taking more money from my college loans than I needed to pay comic artists for commissions,
right.
Which at the time seemed like a great idea. But now I'm oh God, why are my loan payments so high? It's oh, that's right. But really what I was doing is I then became a teacher out of college, and I was teaching public school, and I was just basically using all my money to pay for different comic pitches and projects, and a pitch being a 5-page story sample that you would then send out to get a book greenlit, which I know we've talked about, but it is kind of crazy that that's all it takes is 5 pages of a story at a time. But
yeah, that's insane. So and just to clarify that's 5 pages that you write and then you get an artist to draw. So it's 5 fully completed pages of the first issue.
Yeah, lettered, colored, and that's why I said that one of the best things I ever did was kind of do that pseudo self-published, small publisher graphic novel where I basically had to do everything, because it taught me a lot of what the process was. It taught me all the different parts, what goes into it. And without that, I never would have been able to move forward, because you have to be, it falls on the writer a lot, but someone in the small pool of people involved has to know book design and production. Well, not book design, the writer, but basically writer has to project manage a lot. You wrangle everybody and get together. And I learned a lot of that, and thankfully remained pretty decent at that part, because it is a weird different skill set. And so basically I did that one novel graphic novel while I was still in school. And afterwards I was just going to a lot of cons. One of my very good friends, Matt Rosenberg, was breaking in at the same time, and we would hang out a lot together and go to a lot of safe shows and just sleep on people's floors. And Matt actually is a writer at Marvel right now. He's writing Uncanny X-Men as we speak.
Oh, wow.
So it worked out for him as well, which is funny because like it is interesting because a lot of the people who were around when I was breaking in all have like really good careers now. So it's rewarding to see like we all put the time in, and thankfully a good percentage of us quote unquote made it, though, you know, no one's ever really made it.
Yeah, you're always remaking it.
Yeah, but it was like really just like going to a ton of comic shows, making your own books, and just like hitting that wall until something sticks, because you never know when the opportunity is going to really come up. And for us, thankfully, it was sooner than later with Five Ghosts. And Five Ghosts was a really weird project, inceptionally, if that's even a word, but from inception, because Chris Mooneyham and I were just committed to doing this like sci-fi Western book we were going to do. And we had done like 80 pages of it. Like there was a lot of this project done, and just no one cared. Like it just did not spark interest from anyone.
Like fully complete pages, drawn and everything?
Yes, like done. Like, and it was colored by our friend Tyler Champion, real name. And it was called Endless West. And we were like so excited about it. Like it looked great. It was done. I thought it read really well, and it was an intriguing concept, but just no one cared. We could not get anyone to give a damn. And around that time, I think I had just left teaching and was kind of like screwed and on unemployment. And I had the idea for Five Ghosts because we had talked about wanting to do a story about a thief. And I was like, okay, like I want to do like a 40s period piece, Indiana Jonesy thief story, but like it needs to have something a little more like, for lack of a better word, like comic booky or high concept. And I was like, oh, well, what if he could like channel like Sherlock Holmes or something? I don't even know why I thought of that, but I was like, oh, well, what if he could channel other characters? And it turned into Five Ghosts from that. And I brought it to Chris, and Chris was like, oh, that sounds cool. Like, let me sketch, and immediately drew like some of the first like key Five Ghosts art. And I'm like, yeah, that looks good. Like, let's do that. And he was like, no, we're trying to do this 80 page, or it was supposed to be like 160 page. We're like halfway through this other book. We shouldn't stop. But like knowing fully in my heart that no one gave a damn about the Western, unfortunately.
Right.
Because it had been like rejected everywhere. We had sent it to a bunch of publishers, and everyone was like, no, thank you. So I convinced him to draw the first 5 pages of the book, which are the actual first 5 pages of Five Ghosts. And he did. And I remember at New York Comic Con, I want to say 2011 or 2012, like, and I paid a bunch of money idiotically getting like a vendor booth, not even like an artist alley booth, which is typically where you go. And I remember we were just next to like people selling like purses and stuff. And we were trying to sell comics, and no one gave a damn, but everyone kept coming by and looking through his portfolio. And he had those first 5 pages of Five Ghosts, and he had actually hand lettered them so people could read them. And everyone was like, this book looks really cool. Like, when are you doing this? And that was kind of like the nail in the coffin for like, yo, we should do this book. And because I had left my teaching job, that's actually why we ended up doing the Kickstarter for Five Ghosts, because I had no money, like just at all. And we did that Kickstarter. I can't remember if it was in 2012 or it must have been 2012, because the book came out on Image in March 2013. So this was like fall of 2012. And lo and behold, we managed to like rustle some money together, get the book done for next year's New York Comic Con, which was 2013. And we self-published it as still like we got no responses when we were sending out like the first kind of issue. I was just like, oh, no one cares. We're just gonna have to self-publish this. And the next year when we self-published it, we immediately like sold out at Comic-Con. And this is after years of not being able to sell anything. And I remember being so happy because people seemed to like the book, but so stressed out that we would have to make more on our own. And again, I had no job. I was living in New York City and just completely stressed. But from there, from someone picking up at New York Comic Con 2013, it actually got its way to Image, the publisher at Image, who saw it and then later emailed us, was like, hey, would you like to do this at Image? I was like, oh God, please, yes. And that was probably the luckiest day of my life.
Us.
Yeah, and that's literally how it all spun out. Like, talk about right place, right time. But I'd done a good deal of work to make sure like we were featured on some websites, even when it was self-published, and like really got some press that led to it getting picked up being sold. Because I remember we had 60 copies because I paid for them out of my wallet, and we did them nice. They were like oversized and on newsprint. And I have one of them at my parents' house, but it became a pretty sought after like Five Ghost collectible within the comic market. Those quote unquote self-published versions from New York Comic Con. Yeah. But we had 60 of them, and again, that doesn't sound like much, but as I said, to me, it felt like we sold like 1 million copies. And,
sure, yeah, totally.
Yeah, that was a very long story that I hope was interesting. But no, it was a pretty organic thing, and as I said, it was really teachable, putting everything together. And the interesting thing is the first issue of Five Ghosts that like came out on Image is exactly what we published, because I feel like a lot of people don't realize that mostly you do not have editors at Image Comics unless you hire one yourself.
Yeah.
And it is, in a way, like glorified self-publishing, but with their brand. And when a lot of people ask, like, oh, like, how do I know if my book is good enough? It's like, well, go pick up some Image books, and if it looks and read as good as those, that's what you should be able to make in your house by yourself before you really are ready to be marketing things.
Totally. And what does an editor do for a comic book exactly?
They can take a few different roles depending on the scale and scope of the book and what company they're at, but typically they will handle a lot of the scheduling, coordinating between the teams, sometimes like being the go-between between the artist, the writer, the colorist, and anyone else who's on the book. Doing a lot of like the clerical work, like making sure the talent gets paid. And then very specifically, they will edit creatively as well, especially at the script stage. They'll provide feedback for everything, to your like story, to the pacing, to the dialogue, and kind of keep working with you through that stuff as well. And especially important, obviously, at Marvel and DC, where there's a lot of like canon, there's a lot of specific character voice and things like that. But on the spectrum of stuff you create in your own, like obviously if you want someone to help with that stuff, you can hire them. But for me, like I find with the books we've done on Image, like I just kind of self-edit.
Yeah.
And the writer almost becomes the editor in that capacity, where I'm in charge of all that clerical work on top of the creative generation as well. And again, some people swear by it and love it and will hire freelance editors for their own independent work. But for me, I suppose that's almost sometimes the fun of doing stuff on my own as well.
Yeah.
But they are fairly indispensable at bigger companies or any kind of corporate work or work for hire where multiple parties need to be coordinated. And definitely, like, if you are making your living as a comic book writer, you will invariably be working on multiple projects. So sometimes it's nice to have different kind of point people who are supporting you. Yeah.
Too much all at once. Yeah, that's interesting, man. And it's interesting too that you started in the film realm, learning, you know, how to write a feature film and scripting in that angle, and then moved to comic book writing eventually. Was there a huge difference in the storytelling for you from thinking about things in terms of, you know, 24 frames per second versus a one cell of a comic book? Was there a leap for you in the difference in telling a story and even conceptualizing a story between those two mediums, or did you find it pretty much the same?
So the interesting, and a lot of thoughts on this, so strap in.
Seatbelt buckled.
Well, someone who is like, speaking for myself, like a craft nerd and like swears by structure, swears by organization. And
what structure do you usually find yourself in?
I mean, I hardcore believe in like, quote, 5-act structure as the end all be all of this is how stories work.
Okay, and let's dive in. Let's dive right into it. What's the 5-act structure? Break it down.
Well,
putting you on the spot, man.
I was trying to come up real quick with like funny names, but really just like the thing that was so important to me though, just to step back, of what I learned in screenwriting class that I had never learned before in my entire life, was even just the like beginning of actual practical structure. Like obviously in like middle school and even high school, like they'll tell you like stories have a beginning, middle, and end, and show you like the like freight tax pyramid and like things like that. But as an educator, like and writing teacher, I find it such a disservice that nowhere else and no other writing class had it ever been like shown to me in a practical sense. And it makes a lot of sense, obviously, for film, right? Because you have the confines of, let's be generous and say 120 pages, but so you have to make it fit. But it was the first time someone ever in my screenwriting teacher being this person, she was one of the first people who ever explained this to me, and it just like immediately clicked in the way that I suppose everyone who's grown up watching movies and consuming media knows implicitly, but like kind of giving it a name and giving it form. And the first thing I ever read was Sid Field's book, which, what's it called again? Is it just called screenwriting or screenplay? I think it's called.
I think it's screenplay. I can never remember between Sid Fields, Robert McKee. All the different ones have similar names, like Story.
Yeah. Well, I know McKee's is Story, and I love that one. But I think Sid Fields is just called Screenplay. And I actually was looking at it again the other day because I love books on writing. I love screenwriting books and have since then consumed them all and really been able to find like a holistic view because of that. But that was the first one I read, and it was like, it felt like someone handed me the keys, right? They were like, here you go, like now go write a movie. And that's why, I go back to like having that hubris of like, oh, now I know how to do it. Like I'm going to fucking write Jurassic Park. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I don't think at any point I would write Jurassic Park, but it was very empowering to see like, oh, this is the stuff I've been circling around. Because I was always a kid when school, like, anytime we got an assignment to write a story, I would write a story and like love it. But I never knew quite honestly like how to do it right. And this was the first time I felt like I learned to do it right. And a lot of those principles, like again, writing an active voice, keeping it visual, and a lot of the best practices for screenwriting, we're able to move over quickly to comics. Because the interesting thing about comics is that there are a few like templates some people will use, but largely there is no proper way to format a comic script.
Yeah.
It is in the same way that a lot of time people will refer to the screenplay as blueprints for a movie, like you're really writing instructions for actors and directors, I suppose. Comics literally are, a comic script at least, is instructions for an artist to draw. And because of that, it can be very, very amorphous. Personally, for me, I do panel by panel breakdowns, like describe every shot and the amount of panels typically on a page, with the caveat that I know the artist is probably going to change it. But the important thing for me that I think screenwriting helped reinforce as well is just that intense sense of being like active and visual. You're not talking too much about like stuff you don't see. And that is the most important thing. Obviously, we know in any visual medium that you're not writing just stuff that reads on the page but can't be represented through pictures. And I feel like that combined with just being a lifelong comics reader and just knowing basically how they flow and the ones I liked and the things that I think were doing interesting, it really just became, I guess initially of thinking like, oh, well, this is my instinct of how like a comic should start from the millions of comics I've read. This is about how many pages should be or a panel should be on a page. And just in my brain, it all just kind of like dovetailed with a lot of the screenwriting practice to be, I don't know, just turned into what turned into, I guess, my comic style, which I don't think is anything mind-blowing now. Like years later, I can be a nerd about it and deconstruct it and say like, oh, well, here's exactly how it should flow. And I guess one of the big things for me that helped is you have like a clear goal. A typical comic is 20, 22 pages. So like you have a stop point. You can't just go. And that structure has always been a little don't be overly romantic and say it's like reassuring to me, but there's a clear end point. You're not just like shooting forward. And 22 is a lot more digestible than even like a pilot at 60 or a feature at 120. 22, yeah. I feel like seems like a small hill to climb, not a giant mountain. And I guess though, really that's the overlap. There is a lot of shared DNA, but then the specifics get different in terms of, I think screenwriting, and not I think, I know screenwriting is a lot more stylistically, God, I can't speak, but like locked, like it needs to read a certain way and look a certain way to probably be considered a screenplay by many professionals. But comics, I feel like, can be a little more amorphous. I feel like a few forms have really taken the kind of like quote comic scripts. Yeah. Like if you Google what does this comic script look like there's a few formats that will come front and center, but really like some people still write like what people call Marvel style or plot style, where they'll straight up just write like no page numbers, no panel numbers, just kind of what happens, and they'll hand that off to an artist, and artist will interpret that into a comic script. And that was how Stan Lee famously wrote, which is why there's a lot of drama about like, oh, well, did he actually write these comics? Because in that format, it literally can be like, okay, Spider-Man walks into a room, Spider-Man talks to Mary Jane about love, Spider-Man goes outside, the Green Goblin flies in, Spider-Man fights with the Green Goblin. Like it can be that general. So the artist has to do a lot of problem solving and effectively break all the storytelling. And when you hear a lot of those arguments about like, oh, did Stan Lee actually write these comics or did Jack Kirby? Like an argument can be made like that. Kirby just kind of plots and turn them into stories. And then Stan would add the dialogue afterwards is how it goes. So like he'd hand off that loose plot outline, comic would get drawn, he'd get it back, and then he'd put all the word balloons in, which is a wild ass way to work. And some people I know love doing that and they like that collaboration, but it is just such a level of trust that, well, I trust the people I work with implicitly, but I feel like I'm not ready to give up control like that. Like I still, because I am such a structuralist, I like to know the pacing exactly. And that's one thing I love about comics versus screenplay. Like in a comic script, it really is all about the pacing of it, the rhythms, and the structure for me.
Yeah, totally. But going back, is there sort of a simple explanation of how you see and use a 5-act structure?
So for a screenplay, like looking at a solid 120 pages and using kind of the language of 3-act structure to explain 5-act structure, which seems whack, but let's go for it. It'd really be one, making sure there's a concrete midpoint, the midpoint being almost the most important point in the story. And separating Act 1 into two discrete parts where if we're really looking to get granular and look at page counts, like if your Act 1 is 30 pages, the first 15 would be Act 1, the second 15 would be Act 2, then separating was traditionally Act 2 into Acts 3 and 4 with the midpoint kind of in the middle, like being a very, very big scene that then Act 4 is that back half of a traditional Act 2 where you have like kind of some deflating and ends with like kind of the all is lost moment and then kind of ramps us back into what is traditionally Act 3, which I would call Act 5. And that's a sloppy way to look at it to approximate a traditional screenplay, but really the big things that it calls out for me is that the midpoint is typically a huge set piece or a very, very important part of the story. And we kind of get some downtime after that, and then come up into the climax, which is also a really big part of the movie. And I feel like the modern Marvel movies have really taken this into stride. And what it gives you craft-wise is it gives you a middle that has a big part that pops and doesn't get boring. You know Act 2 problems because you're building basically to the midpoint, recovering from the midpoint and going into the climax. So the best example I would give is, I guess, in Civil War, I think is a better Marvel Avengers Civil War. Or no, Captain America Civil War, I guess it was called, right? But anyhow, the Civil War movie, the heroes all fighting each other is like an awesome midpoint. Like that's a big part in the middle of the movie that pops that we all remember. Then it kind of falls back apart. And then it gets to the other climax where kind of Cap and Iron Man fight. And Iron Man 1, I feel like, was also a really solid 5-act movie, so to speak. And again, with all of this, it can be so amorphous, like talking about it, and everyone can argue about different structures to impose on things. But truly, without being a total douche about it, but 5-act is the Shakespearean one. And if you look at things like Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet, like Shakespeare really loved to put like a big thing in Act 3. Like the most memorable scenes of a lot of these plays are in Act 3. And then 4 is kind of the fallout from that and leads into, again, a climax in 5. But I would I'm butchering it a little bit, but I would highly, highly recommend the book Into the Woods by John York. And that has really been a guiding light for me. Like, it's a great post-screenwriting book because it does look at a lot of other books and adages holistically and says, hey, what we're all talking about is actually the same thing, and it's 5-act structure, because I think 5-act structure is the closest approximation to just that beginning, middle, end that we all know exists.
Yeah.
And organizationally, what I like about it is it really just allows me to, and how to apply it to a comic I will move into, is when you're looking at a comic book, typically a modern graphic novel, quote unquote, so collection is about 5 issues worth, 110 pages, 120 pages, which, lo and behold, is about the length of a screenplay. The hardest thing for me is that, unlike film, and I know that it's still not perfect, but how a page is a minute in a film, and I know, especially you as a filmmaker, that's probably not always true in so many ways, but
it's
a lot harder with comics because you can, well, I suppose it's the same in film though, right? Yeah, you could have a sequence of 2 people talking about their dog be 1 page, or you can do it for 40 pages.
Yeah.
Like, it all just depends on how much you really want to commit. If you want to have the artist show every little detail, if you want to do a lot of like decompressed storytelling, like I feel like that's been a popular term for a while, decompression in modern comics, this idea of making them more filmic, drawing a scene out, like especially smaller scenes, like say like people talking, or using like grids again, like in a 9-panel grid to really pace out a scene slowly. But largely you are looking at 5 issues, which I think concretely fall into those 5 acts. And looking at modern comics, for me, it really helps think in that structure of like, okay, let me look at each of these quote 20-page parts as an individual act in this 5-act story. And that kind of at least gives me better guideposts than just trying to say like, oh, like, is every issue its own episode, quote unquote, or is every issue its own mini film? And obviously with so much of writing theory, like it is fractal, like every scene technically has every part of a bigger story, et cetera, et cetera. But something about the 5 just clicks for me. And I know different things click for different people, but I really do encourage anyone who is interested in kind of structure or storytelling to study 5-act structure a bit more, and particularly read Into the Woods. It's a great read no matter what. And it also gets a little more into like, why do we tell stories? Where does it come from at the end? And I think that stuff really does support the existence of this quote 5-act structure rather than trying to overblow it or over reduce it to just the three.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have not read that book. I'll definitely put that on my list to read next. And for me, it's I usually, because I think it's just terms, people understand 3-act structure so much more just because it's easy beginning, middle, end. But I've said even on the show before that I don't really think of it in those terms too often. Is I just think of beginning, middle, and end. I think of setups and payoffs. But I do agree more with like 4 or 5 act structures. Not agree in the story needs to fall into these things.
Yeah.
I mean, every story has a beginning and middle and end, pretty much. Some, I mean, you could argue that some don't, but for the most part, 99% of the time, they have a beginning, middle, and end. And that is a structure, which I say to just say, I'm sure there's people listening now that's like, ha, structure, you're putting film in a box, how dare you? Where it's like, of course, yeah,
like, all right,
no matter what.
I know this guy was an idiot, but...
Totally. Like, you're writing a script. You're putting your story in a box. That's the point. You're constructing something. There is a construction there. There is a framework there. Whether you want to dissect and figure out what your particular framework is, even if it changes per project or not, there is a framework there.
Absolutely, right? And that's because I do a lot of teaching and mentoring of like just younger writers, and I love structure and find it to be so useful, so actually almost kind of like able to generate ideas for me. It's almost like writing poetry in form. Like, yeah, it's not going to tell you what to write, but it'll give you a clear guidepost. But that's with the caveat, like, you're telling a story, do whatever you want. If you can entertain me and don't need to use any of this, and I don't care how many acts you think you have, et cetera, et cetera. And that was a frustration for me as a younger writer a lot. Like, I would see stuff that I thought was just like so badly constructed, but people would love, and I had to learn like, oh, well, if it's getting the reaction, that's what's important, not the fact that I could sit there and like wag my finger and be like, but in act 2, blah, blah, blah.
Right,
like,
exactly.
Like it falls by the wayside. But
yeah, for me, it's just they're interesting ideas that you can scoop up to utilize if you're having, a hard time with something. But like I said, usually when I'm writing, I'm not thinking in those terms. And sometimes I do. Like there's something that I am working on right now, and I actually look at it as like a 4-act sort of structure where it's act 1, act 2 split into 2, like you're saying, exactly what you're saying, and then act 3. But, I'm developing, I think, 6 things right now, and that's the only one where I'm actually considering an act structure. The rest of them, I'm sure they do because they're just inherently in all of us, like we said, beginning, middle, and end. But I just don't think about it because most of the time, you don't really need to think about it. There's like this gut. Yeah, we need this turn. Oh, we've been doing this time, and then then you go and look back at it, and you're like, oh, that's a midpoint, and you weren't even like trying.
It's so nerdy, right? Like, because like I love the academic part of it, but like at the same time, a child knows how a movie works. Like, show a kid 20 movies, and they can kind of like offhandedly say this to you, and that's why for me, it's a lot of it initially was like, especially after being like so like, I don't want to say moved, but like inspired by learning about structure, like that it was kind of that missing piece for me to like lay those guideposts down instead of just like writing a story that went on and on and on. And more so, like, I feel like it's fascinating to see the overlaps. Like, why does this happen every single time someone tries to tell a coherent narrative? Like, there has to be something there. And I won't go on about it, but like, I really do think like this is how our brains organize information. This is how like we think about things on a cellular level. And all we're really doing is mirroring that. And I would never like dismiss someone who's like really loves surrealism or is really just writing something to be interpreted in a poetic sense or something that's just more about like, I don't know, like very experimental film, like still completely valid. If it can communicate an emotion, like
definitely
that's awesome. But for me, who does a lot of genre writing, who does a lot of writing that follows strict formatting, the real challenge then becomes, how do I get that structure that everyone knows they want implicitly in there without making it predictable, without making it generic? And that is the hard part. That is in 2019, to know like, okay, our audience is so savvy. They've seen so much content. They know how stories work. How can I surprise them? How can I use this to get a better point across? And lo and behold, like anytime I feel stuck, like I'm just like turn my head and look at another piece of fiction, and I'm just amazed at the like brilliant things people can do in the confines of what seems so limited. And it just is inspiring. I mean, I grew up playing music a lot. And it's the same way that like, the 12 notes of a musical staff, but every day someone's turning around and like churning out something brand new. And for me, the structure is reassuring because of that. I at least know like, okay, if someone like sat me down and say, hey, write me a detective story in 10 minutes, like it'll be the most generic, crappy story ever, but I can at least get that skeleton down. And I think that's a really important skill as a writer, and especially as a young writer, to develop, because then you can work on pushing it and know that at least you have that backbone to rely on. And quite honestly, you're able to apply that like structural backbone across any discipline of writing, whether it be like film, comics, TV, games. There is a lot there, and that's why I will be such an advocate for learning this stuff and not dismissing it as just like didactic bullshit, because it really does have a place in terms of just having a solid foundation to lie on. And that, I think, is the most important part. Whether you're like sitting there bullet pointing out your script doesn't matter, because I feel like so much of this is like internalized. And I feel like the real nerdy places I go to now in my career is just like really looking at stuff scene by scene and making sure like that my like moment to moment beats are structurally sound. And so far, like, they all mean something. They're all adding something to the story. They all have something surprising happening, and surprising not in the sense of hyena jumping out of the closet, but like, oh, like someone is getting a different result than they thought, like in creating surprise for the audience. That is where this has all led me. And I feel like it's making me a much better writer. And honestly, like, I'm not always thinking about it, but it has turned me into a much better editor of my own work, which I think is the most important thing, because in the moment, you're just like going for it, you're writing, and whether you have an outline or not, it's not like you're just like mad-libsing in your script. You have to think on the fly and be creative. But I really have seen a huge, huge increase in my ability to edit my own work and others from just being such kind of a student of like craft and structure. And that's why I really will die on that hill and roll my eyes at anyone who's like, well, that doesn't exist. And not to just like plug John York's book, but like, he opens it with excerpts from Charlie Kaufman talking about how he doesn't believe in structure, and then breaks down how perfectly structured every one of Charlie Kaufman's films are. It's like,
I was actually going to say that. Often I'll hear people say that, oh, this has no structure, this goes against the structure. And then I watch it and I'm like, but I see one.
No, and that's the thing, right? Like, no matter what you call it, this is implicit, like, rules of storytelling, which is why I love the, like, not like taking the magic out of it, but like, this is how our brains work. Like, we need this to logically order events. Like, it's not cheating, it's working with what's there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's why I always like to say, because I don't know, it's like, maybe it's like a film purist thing, or is it's like a film school thinking thing, or whatever it is in those moments of like, because I had that film school moment where I was like, ugh, 3-act structure. You don't put me in a box, Yeah. But that's why I like to talk about it as like beginning, middle, and end. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end that's a structure. And then wherever you take it from that, be it 3, 4, 5, don't even think of it at all, that's totally fine. And like you said, I'm totally with you. The surrealist, the experimental, that stuff's amazing. And I think important to push forth the medium and find different things and different ways of doing things. Or maybe it's even thinking about the structure and then breaking the structure and doing it in a different way, and putting things in different places and trying something new. Kind of like, knowing all the rules of composition and, how to lay out a scene of not crossing the line and all that. I break those rules all the time, but knowing them to start with helps me break them in an intelligent way instead of just accidentally breaking them and it not working for what I'm trying to accomplish. You know what I mean?
And I really like one thing that clicked for me hard as I feel like after breaking into comics, I hit a point in my career where I was working on a lot of stuff, probably too much stuff at once, just because I was a full-time freelance writer and I needed that to pay the bills.
Yeah.
So I really started leaning on structure a lot because I had to generate work quickly. And there is some stuff that I feel like, even though it's structurally sound, I wrote, and I'm sure everyone feels this, but was cold. Like, it wasn't doing anything. And I quickly learned, like, it seems like a given, but when you learn it in practice, it's so much more kind of impactful. But like, oh no, it is about that emotional connection. It's about like truly entertaining people. And no one is going to sit there and as I said, I apologize for reiterating, but no one's going to be like, oh, cool, like Act 4. They're going to be like, did I like this? Or like, did I react? Was this funny? Was this entertaining? Was this scary? And that's the part of me that's always at war. Like, as someone who really loves structure and wants to see things well crafted, I can also really just step back and be like, oh, well, if something's working, it doesn't matter. Like, it really just needs, but I will argue that 9 times out of 10, if something is like any piece of fiction is killing it, it's probably structurally sound.
Right.
It's not like an accident that it's working, quote unquote.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree more that it does need that something special, that bit of magic, that bit of honesty, whatever it is. I always call it on the show, I got, the experience. You're trying to give the audience an
Yeah.
experience. And that's what it means, whether that's an experience of getting to the place where they're crying with the characters or they're, screaming at, a surprising, shocking, horrific moment, or they're gripping the sides of their seat through, the tense moment, or that it just makes them think, whatever it is, from the blockbuster to the indie, very small character drama. It, for me, I really like to think in those two terms, the beginning and middle and end, and more than anything else, giving the audience an experience, bringing them into this world and conveying to them the emotion and the ideas that I'm really wanting to convey. And I think it's what you're saying, but for me, that's like all of it. Like, everything else is just support, but without that, it's nothing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel like the big thing that I really have been fascinated by, not to keep it all about this, is just that looking at how so many things are the same, but still different, and how the sameness of kind of like structure, does not diminish the different effects things have. And it's that secret experiential, like, oomph, right? Like, it's like, oh, well, if this was just simply a pattern, we could have computers writing amazing stories, but
exactly.
They're not. Like, yeah, it's not that easy, but it is a way to help a human being who's processing your entertainment understand that it is organized like in a actual informational way, not just a blast of noise. And again, if you want to go for blast of noise, that's probably cool in its own way as well. But I feel like it's more of, and as I said, I don't mean it as a pejorative, but the fact that I work in a lot of kind of genre, I make like widely consumed like mainstream stories, and a lot of times they are going to follow generic structures, and the challenge then really becomes like, okay, like, what can I say with this? How can I make this surprising, etc. And the number one thing that fascinates me about all stories is the moment that I guess a lot of gurus and screenwriting books call like the all is lost moment. It's that traditional end of act 2 into act 3, or like act 4 and 5 act, where it happens in pretty much damn every story, and we always know it's coming, but it can always be effective.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that I just feel like stands out to me all the time, because typically it's like someone dies, or, like a million ways to talk about this trope, like whiff of death. I think they call it like save of the cat, but it is the down point that leads into the climax. And I find that to be the most fascinating part of story structure, because by the law of physics, it has to be there for the climax to mean anything, to kind of pick back up. But it is like without fail the one anchor point I'm always able to identify on first viewing or first reading of anything, because it is so obvious. But that is just the most fascinating thing to me, as I keep saying, because it's always there. It has to be there. But sometimes when we get there, it's still such a surprise to me. But I know it, and that's the like kind of magic trick of storytelling, like keeping it very structured, but also surprising. But but that is the one thing that I continue to just always circle around, like, damn, like that is the evidence in of itself for me of why this works. Like we don't stop watching every movie because we see it all is lost moment.
Yeah, I mean, we're pattern oriented creatures, and instead of structure being a dirty word, it could be something that you utilize to really be effective in delivering that experience to your audience. I mean, songs have intro, verse, chorus, second verse, second chorus, bridge, chorus. You know what I mean? So there's like patterns in almost every bit of entertainment and everything that we do. So just, latching onto that, I think it can be really helpful. Like I said, I don't always, it's not always at the forefront of my mind when I'm developing something, but there has been a few times, specifically this one I'm currently doing, that it's been extremely helpful in locking in the idea of that structure it also makes it a little less daunting, because if you're thinking of it and like the one I was talking about, it's 4 act 1, 2 split in 2, and then 3, you just have those sections that you can write. I'll write this section, then I just need to get to the point of this section. It helps it feel a lot less like you're climbing Everest,
Yeah. Well, and the one thing I was going to bring it back to comics a bit too, like where my current mind has been, is really looking at a lot of TV writing, because I feel like a lot of my friends are TV writers. I dabbled in it. I've never actually like worked on a show, but I've written pilots and like looked at the formula. And I'm more fascinated by like the old like 20, 25-minute shows, which for a lot of our lives were the shows we consumed. And just the elegance in having what seems almost like 3 or 4 acts in some of these 20-minute shows, where it seems like you're rushing to, and not rushing in a bad way, you're rushing to these act breaks that served as commercial breaks, as a lot of us knew. And like, sometimes there's just such elegance, and like every one of them is a little cliffhanger. And that is what I'm modernly trying to tie back into comics, like keeping in this balance, like, hey, it sounds gross when you say it so plainly, but like every 5 pages, something has to happen to make people want to keep reading. And what it really is like an act break. It's supposed to be a point of interest, like a forward, something that pushes us forward and gives us momentum. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think TV writers have been doing it for so long and so well. And even going back and watching like 30 Rock, like it's a comedy show, but like they are able to just create momentum. And like, you forget that you're only watching 20-minute bits of TV.
Yeah.
There are full plots being, in Seinfeld did it amazingly well. Like, it's just so fascinating to me. And that's the stuff that I feel like actually correlates more to comics, because comics are very short, especially modern comics. And you can use the paneling to create a longer sense of time and decompress stuff. But ultimately, it is a very compact format. In modern comics, if anyone listening is not a comic book reader, typically are sold in magazine form, like just comic book floppies you'll get at a comic store. And those are only 20 pages, 22 pages. And you need to be a really good writer to keep someone wanting to come back and to make 20 pages feel satisfying. Because, I mean, I think it's a problem with the industry, and why a lot of people prefer to read like graphic novel collections, which typically take 4 to 6 of those 20-page issues and bind them together. But it is such a unique format because of that. And typically you will want a really strong cliffhanger at the end of every 20-page issue to keep someone coming back to the store to come buy your next issue. But it becomes very fascinating that you also want that to exist in a balanced sense with the rest of the story. And that's why I say I really do liken it to 5-act writing, because if you look at 5 issues, and honestly, maybe even more like 6 these days, because it's so compressed, you can find like a careful balance and like a really kind of unique alchemy there to kind of keep it interesting, keep it moving, having these ostensibly act breaks between issues. And when I say act break, like truly what I think is important from that is that cliffhanger, that moment that really creates interest and wants to be new information and push us forward.
Yeah.
And that is the most interesting, I think, like overlap for me, and really where my head's been these days, without trying to be like a analytical robot about it, but really looking at things experientially and saying like, hey, like what makes this good? Like what gives this the momentum? What's creating that special interest beyond like, I don't know, like tonal or experiential things or just really good characters, but like in the structure of the plot and the pacing of this, what is creating that excellent momentum? Because there are some people who just do it so implicitly, like it is just damn elegant when you see it.
Yeah, man. And you know, speaking of TV, you actually had Five Ghosts, or have Five Ghosts set up as a pilot with Universal, was it?
Yes. So it is not in development anymore. This was a while back and was a great experience, and for a long time seemed like we were about to get a TV show made. So I don't begrudge that. And it's funny to talk about it in retrospect. So we actually had it, we sold it to Sci-Fi, and Sci-Fi was developing it with a script by Evan Darty, who had written Snow White and the Huntsman, and I think Ninja Turtles, the first one of the newer ones.
Yeah.
God, there's been so many. But so he had a script and they were getting ready to shoot it, but there were just some back and forth, and ultimately they decided not to go to pilot. But it was a wild ride, and seeing your work adapted is fascinating, because I myself was not involved in the physical writing of the script. Like I was allowed to give some notes, as was my co-creator and artist, Chris Mooneyham, but largely it was a little out of our hands. But we have great people we worked at UCP, and it was a great process, because even though we weren't kind of given hands-on direction of the script, we were allowed to give notes and feedback, and were kept really in the loop by some of the key people at UCP and my manager, who was kind of in a lot of these discussions. And it was just a wild ride, and it was fascinating to learn what goes into kind of adaptation and what it feels like to almost have someone like part of your work enough to want to turn it into something else. And I think the first reaction for so many people is like, well, why don't you use just exactly as I made it? Like, do it this way. And obviously that's not the reality of it, but it does really give me a lot of interesting thoughts on like the choices you make when you're writing something sometimes can be the best choices. And when it's being adapted and someone else wants to kind of take a similar idea but almost repackage it, like there's a lot of their own choices that get put in. It becomes a very different beast a lot of times. And we see people say it all the time, and sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's similar. And I always found it interesting that on the Fight Club DVD, there's a really excellent conversation between Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote the Fight Club novel, and Jim Uhls, who wrote the screenplay. And like, Chuck Palahniuk is just like straight up like, yo, the screenplay is better than the book. And they talk a lot about that. And it was always fascinating to me until I saw some of my own work being adapted, like what that feels like, because there is a initial feeling of almost like betrayal, like, oh, but I did it right. Like, why would someone else want to change it? And I think like Kirkman talked a lot about this with Walking Dead though, as well, like being adapted into a show. Like there is a lot of interesting space between the material, right? Like there will always be the book version, there then the adaptation. And watching someone do that in real time with my own book was very fascinating. And again, it's not always bad, it's not always good, but it was definitely very teachable and made me kind of almost feel like I did it right the first time in a lot of ways. Like TV is a very different medium than comics, especially when you start thinking about like budgets and think about different appeal. And I understand a lot of the changes that we were probably going to have to make, but it just did reaffirm me that like, hey, I think the way we chose to tell the story and the way we chose to dole it out and a lot of the choices I made were the right choices. As I went back and I did write my own version of the pilots that all ended up being more closely to the book than I think we had initially gone in some of the TV treatments. And as I said, it was like an interesting affirmation of some of the choices I made, like when writing it, which was very obviously off the cuff and not not as calculated as some of it is. I don't know. I'm meandering a bit on that. But long story short is luckily, like we still do have the rights and hopefully one day we can get it back out there. But everyone was great to us and I have no regrets. And we really did as much as we could. And we're so close to that finish line, but not quite. And I'm trying to remember when it happened pretty quick because the book came out in March of 2013. I think definitely like a year later, we might have announced on deadline that it had sold like summer of 2014. But I remember there was a lot of back and forth on the drafts of the pilot. And at that point, we were just kind of like twiddling our thumbs, like, is this going to get made or what? And,
are we doing this or no?
Yeah, like, is our book going to be super popular all of a sudden?
Yeah.
And,
what a crazy ride, though, man.
Yeah, and I would, as I said, I ultimately, like, yeah, in a perfect world, I wish they would have made the show, but there was just so many teachable moments from it and so many good connections made on my part and learning a lot about the film industry, a lot about the TV industry, and I'm really thankful to see a lot of people kind of like making it over the line and getting things out. Like a good example, I feel like Rick Remender right now, who is a friend and a fantastic writer who just put out Deadly Class as a show. Deadly Class is a phenomenal comic and a really good show that Sci-Fi just did. And I think that almost served as the benchmark for like how good adaptation should work, especially the pilot. I know Rick had written the pilot with his co-writer Miles. I cannot remember his last name like an idiot right now, but I think that's one of the most authentic kind of like comic to film adaptations I've seen in a long, long time. And I wish those guys nothing but success as they move forward. And it's really a fascinating time to see a lot of these projects actually making it onto TV, which has always been the battle. Like everything's been optioned back and forth, like in the comic space so much, but I think we're really in a great spot where a lot of it is coming out, and not to mention all like the Marvel and DC stuff as well, but we're kind of making it more into the indie sphere and seeing those come through as actual productions.
Yeah, man, for sure. It's definitely an amazing art form and such a great way to visually tell a story in a different way from film. So for anybody listening now, I mean, reading comics I think is fantastic if you want to be a filmmaker. Even if you don't want to write a comic book or get into that world, I think reading those and looking at how it's the story is visually told, I think there's so much value there when it comes to being a filmmaker, especially how characters are treated in a lot of comic books. I think even I saw somebody tweet it, I think it was Christopher McQuarrie tweeted something similar online not too long ago, and I just
like literally the other day, right? I think I saw him.
Yeah. So and what
a few days back, yeah,
it was either him or James Mangold. I can't remember who said it. It could have been like Guillermo del Toro, and I'm totally messing this up.
I think it was McQuarrie. I remember saying specifically. Yeah.
I was just reading and I was like, yes, I could not agree more with that. I've pulled so much inspiration for a lot of my ideas from just reading comic books. So for anybody listening who wants to be a filmmaker, or maybe they're thinking, hey, maybe I do want to, lean toward the comic book world, what would be some of your advice on getting started just writing, comic books, but also just in general?
Well, first and foremost, like I think you kind of skirted around that. Like it is accessible in a way that film is not. And I feel like that's what drew me to it. Like, I love this idea that I can actually make this.
Yeah.
I don't need $1 billion, especially someone who loves, like, again, I love like big action adventure. Like, I like sci-fi and stuff that I can't like shoot with my iPhone. Uh, or
Totally.
without making it, like, I'm not going to make Indiana Jones on my iPhone, unfortunately.
Right.
But the first thing I said, extremely accessible. The caveat being it all relies on finding a artistic collaborator. And the level of friction you have to deal with that is very high and can dissuade a lot of people, because you have to understand, one, like, you will probably have to pay someone for their time. Like, drawing comics is very, very hard, takes a long time. And if you are not ready to kind of pony up some money, like, you're going to be one of those people who people retweet being like, looking to grab someone for exposure, or just quite honestly not able to find anyone to collaborate with. And really, that collaboration is, for lack of a better term, it is like a marriage. You will be involved with these people for a long time. Like, you want to treat them fairly, you want to work with them, and it is a creative partnership. So whatever woman or man you end up kind of working with, like, you really need to go into it as a collaborator. If that sounds uncomfortable to you, go write a novel. Don't bother, because you really need to be willing to put up with another person. You're not going to just be dictating to them. And I don't mean that to sound negative, but truly, like, I think it is a misconception some people have. Like, they think they're just handing off a script and being like, draw it, art robot. But no, there's another human on the other end. So finding an artist, I would highly recommend, like, using Twitter, just searching for, a lot of people will throw up just samples of their work, like, say, hey, I'm looking for work, or just be like, people who are throwing up samples as like college students or people graduating from school. And a lot of times working professionals do have time. So if there's a comic artist you like, it's always worth sending them an email and seeing what their schedule is. But quite honestly, anyone who's like putting out mainstream work right now will need a real salary. Like, so budget accordingly. But definitely I would do as much research as you can, because lo and behold, you have a great idea, you're interested in starting. You don't want to seem super green, especially if you get like someone you really want to draw the book involved. There are a few books that I would actually recommend. There's one that Brian Bendis, who is a phenomenal writer and comic book author, like most notably created Miles Morales, created Jessica Jones, and he has a book called Words for Pictures that is a really, really unique and excellent book about writing comics, because it's not like a how-to book as much as it kind of explains the craft and explains a lot of these parts. Like, hey, how does my script turn into a comic, and all the in-between. And also, Greg Pak and Fred Van Lente have a book called How to Create Comics Like the Pros, I believe. And that also brings a lot more of the production-oriented parts into it, like, oh, what is lettering, like how you format your pages, et cetera, et cetera. But first and foremost, I would say go read some comics too. Like, if you are not super familiar with the format, but you have an interest, go buy some modern comics. And I don't mean like stuff from the 80s. I mean stuff that's on the shelves now. And truly, like, the best exercise, and it sounds so silly in like grade school, but the best exercise you can do to learn to write comics, like, if you like a comic book, is just look at what they're doing and take a comic that's done and try to write it as a script.
Yeah.
Like, write panel 1, wide shot, 3 people in the shot, panel 2, close it, and just get a feel for how it's constructed. Because there's a lot of different rules and a lot of different styles. But to just start learning those basics is really important. And I mean, I will throw out some basic tips. Like, if you're trying to start writing a comic strip for the first time, try not to go over 5 panels a page. That's a nice, like, balanced, normal comics page. Like, obviously you can do whatever you want. You can draw it as a circle inside a fractal for all I care, like, when you're doing it. But 5 panels tends to be the upward limit, like, of a kind of normal, well-paced standard book. When writing dialogue, really try not to go over 20 words per comics balloon. Like, this is something a lot of people will do, and it makes their comics look very amateurish, because ultimately someone's going to have to letter it, and you have to keep in mind, like, that goes on the artwork, is a big physical part of the page. And obviously, if you're like going to like 25, 30, don't sweat it. But like, once you start getting over about 20 words, those balloons start getting really big, and nothing looks worse than a comic that's just covered with these giant dialogue balloons with like 60 words in them. And I think Warren Ellis had originally said that, but it is really something that, or maybe Brubaker, who's fantastic. And if you truly just don't know where to begin, I would read Saga by Brian K. Vaughan. It's one of the like best books running. I would read Criminal by Ed Brubaker. Criminal is like a pulpy noir comic about crime. And I think there's a lot of very filmic, good stuff there that you can learn. Some perennials like Preacher is actually an excellent book, and it's very edgy, and if you are particularly religious or don't like kind of like shock, gross out humor, I won't recommend it, but obviously it was adapted. But Preacher is actually, the art of Preacher is very balanced. It really carries that like few panels on every page, like good storytelling lessons to learn.
Yeah.
And just, as I said, go to your library, look at Comixology online. I'm sure you can find something you're interested in, but just do your homework, because it can be a little annoying to a working artist or even an artist starting out if you don't know much about the process. But that's really where I would start. It is and as I said, I love it. I will always make comics. I think it is so much more accessible than so many people think, but it is important to just kind of start off on the right foot. And like everything, and anyone who's in a creative process knows, like, your first comic probably won't get published, but it's still worth making and still kind of getting out there and moving forward. And who knows, maybe it will be and become Walking Dead. So you could be like, look, I did it. I don't care what that man on the podcast said. But there's definitely a lot of opportunity, though, out there too, especially with like digital publishing now, and just like even many people like who are making a great living off webcomics, or just like things they just post online and get organic fandoms that way. But really the struggle will be finding a good collaborator, and there is no easy way to do it, unfortunately. So I would say places like DeviantArt still, like, I think a lot of people post. And the one big tip I will say there is, like, look for people who actually want to draw sequential comic book art. So I mean pages with actual panels on them, because there are a lot of great illustrators who can draw like one-page illustrations, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily comfortable or good at doing comic book pages. And you need someone who is good at sequential storytelling, because a lot of times your book will live or die based on how good the artist is, and you're just doing yourself as a writer a disservice if you're getting someone who just does not know some fundamentals of the form as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great advice, man. I know you're busy, so I'm not going to keep you any longer.
I was about to say, I'm like, I hope you're not like, well, I had to turn off the recording an hour ago because you won't shut up.
Let's just go for another hour. But yeah, man, that's really great advice, and I love the stuff on structure too. That stuff is always really fascinating to me, especially watching films and looking at how you perceive its structure and what makes sense to you that you could then apply to your own work. I just think all that stuff is really great. So again, thanks for taking the time, and I'm sure I'll have you on again pretty soon once we have some more interesting stuff to talk about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Always my pleasure.
Thanks, man. Big thank you to Frank. If you want to find out more, definitely jump over to filmriot.com/podcast. Find the episode page for this episode. I'll put links there for the different books that he's written and how you can connect with him online. Of course, you can find me online at twitter.com/Ryan_Conley. And until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.